May the world become peaceful. May all men and women be gentle and honest. May all think of mutual welfare. May the minds of all be turned to the highest good. May there be devotion in the hearts of all to the Supreme Lord. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Surely one of the most difficult things in life, in all human life, is changing behavior. I'm talking about changing our own behavior, not that of others, which is often next to impossible. Just ask any parent. If you Google behavior change, you'll find plenty of articles explaining why behavior change is so hard, often citing research from neuroscience and chemistry to support their conclusions. For those of us on a spiritual path, we know that change is essential if we are to reveal our divine heritage. Cardinal Newman put it directly: to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. To become who we really are, we have to change who we seem to be. We all know that understanding does not often produce behavioral change. Think of all the people who know that smoking can lead to cancer but do it anyway. Or the people who've been given a mantra by a spiritual teacher but fail to use it regularly. In a spiritual sense, we may all be bad learners. How many of us don't always say the kind word, do the kind deed, avoid the critical thought, in spite of the innumerable lessons we've heard from Jesus, Buddha, Holy Mother, and other spiritual personalities that that's what we're supposed to do? Holy Mother and other spiritual teachers tell us, but we don't seem to really take it in. How many of us have heard from Ramakrishna, Gandhi, and our mothers about how important it is to tell the truth? Although not harsh truths, of course. Yet how many times do we use partial truths, bent truths, or out-and-out untruths because it suits our purpose at the time? If we were really good learners, we would only need to hear the lesson once to put it into practice. As they say in the Ozarks, once you've been kicked by a mule, you don't learn anything the second time. We keep hearing the same truths time after time, and they seemingly go in one ear and out the other. Bad learners. If we accept the fact that most of us are bad learners, of spiritual lessons particularly, it follows that just going through bad times is not enough for us to learn our lessons. I've known several people whose lives seemed to be an uninterrupted string of disasters, yet their attitude never seemed to change, and they kept making the same poor life choices that got them into trouble in the first place. You've probably known similar people yourself. Of two persons having the same trying experience, one may reflect, recover, and blossom, while the other is depleted. We have to have some willingness, indeed some ability, to learn from life's lessons before we are changed by them. In our sunroom, we have a framed quote attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson, which says, "Bad times are occasions a good learner would not miss." Buddha knew this exactly when he said, "We learn not from experience, but from our capacity for experience." Or as Aldous Huxley put it, experience is not what happens to a person, it is what a person does with what happens to him. Too often, though, we lack this capacity to change ourselves for the better after the inevitable tragedies that life brings us. We need help being transformed. Ralph Waldo Emerson again, who seemingly had a quote for everything, said, "Our chief want is someone who will inspire us to be what we know we could be." Our chief want is someone who will inspire us to be what we know we could be. The Oxford Dictionary says transformation is a marked change in form, nature, or appearance. Today we're going to discuss the transformation of two lives So we need to clarify what we mean by transformation. The transformations we'll see are not sea changes, a complete and radical transformation of personality, such as happened to Ebenezer Scrooge in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I like to think of this as the magic wand kind of transformation that happens in tales of wizards and fairies. As you remember, Scrooge began the story as a cold-hearted miser who said "bah humbug" to Christmas. But after seeing the three ghosts of Christmas, he became a model of generosity and kindness who exemplified the true spirit of Christmas. Scrooge before was almost totally different from Scrooge after. This is not the kind of transformation we'll talk about today. The seeds of the true transformation we'll discuss are already present in the person who is transformed. Obviously, the traits were latent, or the person wouldn't have experienced the life crises in the way in which they did. But the person clearly shows the potential for the transformation which occurred. A good example, again from Christmas, is George Bailey in the classic movie It's a Wonderful Life. After spending a life giving up his own dreams to help others, George is badly depressed by his failures and contemplates suicide. The prayers of family and friends bring him a guardian angel, Clarence, which seems like a very un-angel-like name, perhaps because Clarence is still earning his wings. Like Dickens' Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, Clarence shows George what the town would be like if he'd never been born. This glimpse of an alternate reality is enough to make George grateful for all that he has, all that he has done for others, and to ask for his life back. The townspeople then rally behind a transformed George, which leads to a memorably happy Christmas ending where a small ringing bell tells us Clarence has earned his wings. In substance, George was the same person, but in form and outlook, he had been transformed. Clarence helped George become who he innately knew he could be. Today, we'll focus on two people who'd been through the most unfortunate life circumstances, but who had the benefit of Ramakrishna's divine touch. This allowed them to learn from these experiences in transformative ways to become who they could be. Their stories will present some ways we too can experience transformation, even without the benefit of a divine physical touch. The devotees are Golap Ma and Girish Ghosh. There's probably no more agonizing human experience than the loss of loved ones, particularly those losses that seem to come before their time. While working as a nurse at Children's Hospital, I came to understand firsthand the meaning of the story of the king and the blessing. When the king's beloved son produced his first grandchild, the king went to a revered holy man to ask a blessing for his family. But the king was incensed when all the holy man would say was, "You will die, your son will die, and your grandson will die." As the angry king was about to order his guards to throw the holy man into prison, the holy man quietly said, "I have given you the greatest blessings, O king. It is the natural order for each generation to pass in its turn, making way for those that follow in due course. For this order to be disturbed is among the greatest of tragedies. For the order to be maintained is the greatest of blessings." For a parent, suffering the loss of a child is certainly one of life's greatest tragedies. Golap Sundari Devi, or Golap Ma, was one of Holy Mother's closest companions, and it was a tragedy of this kind that brought her to Ramakrishna. She was married at a young age to a poor Brahmin who died in a few short years, leaving her to care for a young son and daughter. Then the son died while still a small child, so the daughter, Chandi, the last of Golap's family, became the center of Golap's life. Chandi grew into a charming young woman and was successfully married to a wealthy Calcutta landlord. But then Chandi died unexpectedly, throwing Golap Ma into unending bouts of crying and relentless self-reproach. She felt like she was adrift, alone in the world. A neighbor, Yogin Ma, moved by Golap Ma's suffering, brought her to see Ramakrishna in 1885. Golap Ma later described this meeting. Quote, "When I first went to the master, I was tormented with grief for my daughter, Chandi. Yogin took me to him. He touched my head and removed all grief from my heart. It was amazing. In a moment, my mind became calm and serene. I immediately laughed like a jnani. I felt that I had come to this world to act in a play. Who is whose mother and who is whose daughter? In my childhood, I'd played with cloth dolls, and after that, I played with flesh and blood dolls. This world is nothing but a play with dolls, so why should I cry for my daughter? It's a glorious thing to cry for God. Such was the power of the master," end quote. We've all heard the saying, when you get to your wit's end, you find God lives there. After Golap Ma poured her heart out to Ramakrishna by telling him of her many losses, he told her, "You are fortunate. God helps those who have no one to call their own." He then sang a song, "Dwell, O mind, within yourself, enter no other's home. If you but seek there, you will find all you are searching for. God, the true philosopher's stone, who answers every prayer, lies hidden deep within your heart, the richest gem of all." Golap Ma was greatly attracted to the master by this first visit and became coming regularly. M describes one of these visits in his entry in the Gospel for June 13th, 1885. The entry begins, "About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sri Ramakrishna was resting in his room after the midday meal. A pundit was sitting on a mat on the floor. Near the north door of the room stood a Brahmin woman, who was Golap Ma, who had recently lost her only daughter and was stricken with grief. Ramakrishna then spent some time conversing with M, the pundit, and other visitors. Then he began talking of a boyhood friend. Quote, "As a boy at Kamarpukur, I loved Ram Malik dearly, but afterwards, when he came here, I couldn't even touch him. Now he has a shop at Chanak. I sent for him many a time. He came here the other day and spent 2 days. Ram said he had no children. He brought up his nephew, but the boy died. He told me this with a sigh. His eyes were filled with tears. He was grief-stricken for his nephew. He said further that since they had no children of their own, all of his wife's affection had been turned to the nephew. She was completely overwhelmed with grief. Ram said to her, 'You are crazy. What will you gain by grieving? Do you want to go to Benares?' You see, he called his wife crazy. Grief for the boy totally deluded him. I found he had no stuff in him. I couldn't touch him," end quote. The Brahmin lady still stood near the north door. She was a widow. Her only daughter had been married to a very aristocratic man, a landlord in Calcutta with the title of Raja. Whenever the daughter visited her, she was escorted by liveried footmen. Then the mother's heart swelled with pride. Just a few days ago, the daughter had died, and now she was beside herself with sorrow. The Brahmin lady listened to the account of Ram Malik's grief for his nephew. For the last few days, she had been running to the master from her home at Bagh Bazar like an insane person. She was eager to know whether Ramakrishna could suggest any remedy for her unquenchable grief. Sri Ramakrishna resumed the conversation to M, quote, "The truth is that God alone is real and all else unreal. Men, universe, house, children, all these are like the magic of the magician. But the magician alone is real and his magic unreal. The unreal exists for a second and then vanishes. Birth and death are like magic. You see the magic for a second, and then it disappears. God alone is real, and all else unreal. Water alone is real. Its bubbles appear and disappear. They disappear into the very water from which they arise. God is like an ocean, and living beings are its bubbles. They are born there, and they die there. Children are like the few small bubbles around a big one. God alone is real. Make an effort to cultivate love for him and find out the means to realize him. What will you gain by grieving? All sat in silence. The Brahmin lady said, "May I go home now?" The master said to her tenderly, "Do you want to go now? It is very hot." "Why now? You can go later in a carriage with the devotees." Some visits later, Ramakrishna introduced Golap Ma to the Holy Mother and said, "You should feed this Brahmin girl well. Sorrow is assuaged when the stomach is full." In the incidents we've just heard, the Master began helping Golap Ma by touching her. We're familiar with the extraordinary effects produced by Ramakrishna's touch, particularly when he touched devotees in a semi-ecstatic state on January 1st, 1886, which we know as Kalpataru Day. This is the day on which Ramakrishna was said to have become the mythical wish-fulfilling tree. Some devotees had visions of their chosen deities, some laughed, some wept, some meditated, but all were profoundly affected by transmission of the Master's superhuman power through his physical touch. This was an extraordinary situation, though, which ended once Ramakrishna returned to normal consciousness. Still, in everyday circumstances, the Master's touch had amazing powers to change others. Swami Saradananda wrote, quote, "It is difficult to describe the wonderfully enchanting power of the Master's touch and his words. We have seen and heard many instances of how the Master, with a mere touch, would draw within himself the powers that kept others from realizing the truth, thereby reducing their intensity or permanently destroying them. We have also seen it happen that someone would say something but not create any impression on others, whereas the Master would say the same thing, and it would penetrate the listeners' hearts in such a way that from that point on, the current of their lives was changed. We sometimes observe that if a newcomer argued with the Master, adopting a contrary view, or if a person came to him with a hostile attitude for some reason, the Master would tactfully touch that person during their conversation, and immediately the person would begin to accept what he said. Of course, he did that only with visitors who pleased him. One day he volunteered the reason for this gesture, telling us, quote, "People don't easily accept what others say because they're influenced by egoism and have the attitude that they are in no way inferior to anyone else." Pointing to his body, he explained, quote, "As soon as they feel of the touch of the being within this and feel the influence of his divine power, their egoism can no longer raise its head. When a hooded snake is touched by a particular herb, it immediately bends its head. My touch has the same effect on an inflated ego. That's why I discreetly touch them during conversation." As we can hear from these passages, Ramakrishna's touch was an important adjunct in his teaching, and we can observe several things about its use. Primarily, the person and the circumstance had to be sympathetic. Ramakrishna himself said that he could not touch Ram Malik. On Kalpataru Day, even in his ecstatic state, Ramakrishna declined to touch two devotees, saying, "Not now." Apparently, in some way or other, they were either not ready or not able to receive the touch at that time. Fortunately, we do know that later both did receive his divine touch. Sardananda mentioned that Ramakrishna only touched visitors that pleased him, so it was not as easy as a simple zap and the person was transformed. The person had to be receptive, to be open and ready for the effects of the touch, which the power within Ramakrishna was quick to recognize. Golap Ma was very receptive because in her endless crying, she was imploring God for relief from her suffering. Ramakrishna's touch was a way of separating the person from their ego, of stilling their minds so that his words would get a receptive hearing and find a permanent home, unimpeded by what the person already thought they knew. Spiritual literature has numerous references to marvelous effects produced by the touch of saints and sages. Through the force of their spiritual power, they are able to instantly push us in a spiritual direction through physical contact. The problem is in staying pushed. A young child on a bicycle may move very fast when given a shove by one of his parents, but once the shove loses momentum, the child can only go as fast as his own legs can pedal. Ramakrishna instinctively knew that touch had to be coupled with wise words to penetrate the defenses of the ego and become rooted in consciousness. In its typical use then, Ramakrishna's touch was a preparatory tool for his words. In the same way, soil must be tilled and prepared for the planting of seeds. Touch paved the way by subduing the ego and separating the person from his I consciousness so that he could more clearly understand what the master was going to say. Only then could real learning take place. One of my all-time favorite Zen stories is about a university professor who came to inquire about Zen from Nanin, a Japanese master who lived during the late 1800s. Nanin served tea and poured the visitor's cup full, and then he kept on pouring. When the professor couldn't bear it any longer, he cried, "It is overfull, no more will go in." To which Nanin replied, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" In one of his daily thoughts, Swami Paramananda had a very appropriate quote to this topic. A simple person, full of faith, full of devotion, full of openness of heart, may know a great deal more about God than a philosopher of brilliant intellect. Sometimes it becomes a great advantage to know less. We have not so much to unlearn. We're so full of our own ideas about the way things are that they get in the way of receiving higher truths and understandings. We're not able to listen because we are already talking. If we can set aside what we think we already know and just listen, real learning can take place. A good learner needs to be a good listener. On her first visit, Ramakrishna's touch relieved Golap Ma of the weight of her grief and provided a God-centered perspective on the whole subject of relationships and the play of the world. On the June 13th visit, Ramakrishna reinforced the previous visits by again emphasizing the uselessness of excessive grieving and the need to cry for God alone rather than the people or things of this world. His discussion of his childhood friend Ram Malik, the nephew, grief, the magician, and the nature of reality, all was done expressly for Golap Ma by the all-compassionate master. Golap Ma was so reassured by the master's kindness and affection that she somehow built up the courage to ask him to visit her dilapidated house in North Calcutta. M. describes this visit on July 28, 1885. Quote, "The master arrived at the house of the Brahmin lady who was grief-stricken on account of her daughter's death. It was an old brick house. Entering the house, the master passed the cowshed on his left. He and the devotees went to the roof where they took seats. People were standing there in rows. Others were seated. They were all eager to get a glimpse of Ramakrishna. The Brahmani, which is Golab, had a sister. Both of them were widows. Their brothers also lived in the house with their families. The Brahmani had been busy all day making arrangements to receive Ramakrishna. While the master was at Nanda Basu's house, she had been extremely restless, going out of the house every few minutes to see if he was coming. He had promised to come to her house from Nanda's. Because of his delay, she had thought perhaps he would not come at all. Ramakrishna was seated on a carpet. The Brahmani's sister came to the master and saluted him. She said, "Sister has just gone to Nandu Basu's house to inquire the reason for your delay in coming here. She will return presently." The Brahmani's sister exclaimed, "Here comes sister." The Brahmani came and saluted the master. She was beside herself with joy. She did not know what to say. In a half-choked voice, she said, "This joy is too much for me. Perhaps I shall die of it. Tell me, friends, how shall I be able to live? I did not feel such a thrill even when Chandi, my daughter, used to visit the house accompanied by liveried footmen with armed guards lining both sides of the street. Oh, now I have no trace of my grief at her death. I was afraid Ramakrishna would not come. Then I thought that if that happened, I should throw into the Ganges all the things I had arranged for his reception and entertainment. I should not speak to him any more. If he visited a place, I would go there, look at him from a distance, and then come away." M was amazed to see the Brahmani's sincere joy and her ecstatic mood. He was about to take the dust of her feet. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, and saluted M. She said, "I'm so happy to see you all here." She was talking like this when her sister came up and said, "Come down, sister. How can I manage things if you stay here? Can I do it all by myself?" But the Brahmani was overwhelmed with joy. She could not take her eyes from the master and the devotees. After a while, she very respectfully took Ramakrishna to another room and offered him sweets and other refreshments. End quote. Later that evening, M was alone with Ramakrishna and recorded this conversation. M, how amazing. A similar thing happened with two women at the time of Jesus. They too were sisters and devoted to Christ, Martha and Mary. "Master, eagerly, tell me the story." M, Jesus Christ, like you, went to their house with his devotees. At the sight of him, one of the sisters was filled with ecstatic happiness. The other sister, all by herself, was arranging the food to entertain Jesus. She complained to the master, saying, "Lord, please judge for yourself how wrong my sister is. She is sitting in your room and I'm doing all these things by myself." Jesus said, "Your sister indeed is blessed. She has developed the only thing needful in human life: love for God." Master, well, after seeing all this, what do you feel? M, I feel that Christ, Chaitanya Deva, and yourself, all three are one and the same. Master, yes, yes, one. It is indeed one. This visit to Golab's house occurred only 6 weeks after the visit we read earlier, where Ramakrishna talked about Ram Malik's nephew and the magician for Golab's benefit. Not only is Golab Ma overwhelmed with joy at the master's visit, but she acknowledges that she has literally no trace of the grief that caused her such angst over her daughter's death, caused her terrible suffering only a short time ago. With Ramakrishna's help, Golab Ma has shown to be a very quick study indeed. It seems apparent from her behavior, as well as M's observations, that she manifested the same intense love of God shown by Mary with Jesus. Golab Ma continued her visits to the Master and Dakshineswar, and soon became Holy Mother's constant companion, serving her faithfully for 36 years. She took Ramakrishna's instructions seriously to cultivate love for God and find out the means to realize him. Her daily routine was to rise before 4 a.m., wash, then sit for 3 hours in japa and meditation. Holy Mother once said, Golap has achieved perfection through japa. Swami Chaitananda wrote in They Lived with God, it is truly amazing how Sri Ramakrishna's touch transformed a poor, grief-stricken widow into a dedicated saint. Karma aside, we can say that unfortunate circumstances in life are of two kinds, those that happen to us and those that we bring upon ourselves. While it is tempting to think that we should have more chance of reversing those situations that are of our own making, that we got into them and should be able to get ourselves out of them as well, that may not really be the case. Many bad habits, including addictions, can be so entrapping that no amount of self-effort seems to have an effect. Girish Ghosh had no shortage of bad habits. Having lost his mother at age 11 and his father 3 years later, he drifted into drinking and debauchery as a teenager. He became the leader of a neighborhood gang and would even desecrate the images of gods and goddesses. He saw no need for God and was an avowed atheist, a popular sentiment at the time which considered belief in God foolish and a weakness. But at the same time, an evidence of Girish's paradoxical nature, he helped raise money for food and medicine for the poor and for the cremation of people in his community. He learned enough about homeopathic medicine to treat people. And although he dropped out of numerous schools, he had an extremely keen intellect and was a voracious reader in a wide variety of subjects, including history, philosophy, literature, science, and medicine. Girish was married a year after his father died, and his father-in-law got him a job as a bookkeeper in his office in an attempt to bring some discipline into Girish's life. During this time, he also became involved in the theater, and with characteristic and indomitable energy, Girish might work all day at the office, then act in a play in the evening to return home at 3 or 4 in the morning. When Girish was just 30, his wife became gravely ill after giving birth to a stillborn daughter. In spite of the best doctors, as well as intense care from Girish himself, his wife died, leaving Girish to care for a young son and daughter. Soon thereafter, he lost his job because his employer went out of business. In his grief and despair, he turned to alcohol and to writing poetry. Fortunately, after a short time, he found a new job. Swami Chaitananda writes in his biography of Girish, sometime after taking this job, he went on a business trip to Bhagalpur in central India. One day while he was there, he went for a walk with some friends and in a boisterous mood jumped into a deep ravine. When he tried to climb out, he found he was unable to do so. His friends then attempted to rescue him, but they failed too. One of them commented, "Now we are in real trouble. You are an atheist, and yet no one can save you now but God. Let us all pray together." Girish found himself joining wholeheartedly in the prayer, and strangely, he found a way out of the ravine. After he was safe, he said to his friends, "Today I have called on God out of fear. If I ever call on him again, it will be out of love. Otherwise, I will not call on him, even at the cost of my life." He later wrote in his memoirs, "At such a crisis, I thought, does God exist? Does he listen to the prayers of man? Does he show him the way from darkness to light?" My mind said, yes. Immediately I closed my eyes and prayed, "O God, if thou art, carry me across. Give me refuge. I have none." I remembered the words of the Gita, "Those who call on me only in the days of affliction, to them too I bring succor and refuge." These words sank deep in my consciousness and gave me solace in sorrow. I found the words of the Gita to be true. As the sun removes the darkness of the night, so the sun of hope arose and dispelled the gloom that had gathered thick in my mind. In the sea of trouble, I found the harbor of repose. Desire for inquiry came. Looking into the current of events, sometimes faith, sometimes doubt emerged. Everybody with whom I discussed my problems said unanimously that without instruction from a guru, doubt would not go and nothing could be achieved in spiritual life. But my intellect refused to accept a human being as a guru, for one has to salute the guru with the words, the guru is Brahma, the guru is Vishnu, the guru is the Lord Maheshwara, the God of gods. How could I say this to a man like me? This was hypocrisy, but the tyranny of doubt was intolerable. Terrible conflicts pierced my heart through and through. That condition can better be imagined than described. Suppose a person all of a sudden is forcibly dragged to a dark, solitary room with his eyes covered and kept confined there with no food and drink. What will the state of his mind be? If you can picture his mental condition, you will be able to understand something of my own. There were moments when I was breathless with emotion. Thoughts of despair bit through me like a saw. At other times, the memory of the past was revived, and the darkness of my heart knew no bounds. And having read about Ramakrishna in the Indian Mirror, and hearing that the Brahmo Samaj, a socio-religious organization, had been influenced by Ramakrishna, Girish became curious to know more about this alleged Paramahamsa. In his first meeting, though, Girish thought Ramakrishna's words were pretentious, and he got up and left. Several years later, his second meeting at the home of Balaram Basu left a somewhat better impression. But this time, a friend had enough of Ramakrishna's talk and pulled Girish away with him. Girish soon left the dull business world for the theater full time, and at the age of 36 was hired as manager of the National Theater, a job he held for 2 years. During that period, he wrote 9 dramas and 6 musicals because he needed a new play every 2 months to keep people coming back to the theater. In 1884, Girish's play Chaitanya Leela was the hit of the season in Calcutta, and when Ramakrishna came one evening, Girish met him and escorted his party to box seats. During the performance, Ramakrishna was deeply inspired by the drama and went into samadhi several times. When asked how he liked the play, he said, "I found the representation the same as the real." Now, this statement may not seem like much at face value, but if we consider the speaker in his frame of reference, we can understand that it was the highest praise possible. Girish continues in his memoirs, quote, 3 days later, I was sitting on the porch of a friend's house, which was at an intersection, and I saw Sri Ramakrishna slowly approaching, accompanied by Narayan and a couple of other devotees. No sooner had I turned my eyes toward him than he saluted me. I returned his salute. Then he went on. For no accountable reason, my heart felt drawn towards him by an invisible string. As soon as he had gone a short distance, I felt an urge to follow him. I could not keep calm, for the attraction I felt was not of this earth. It was something for which no former experience had ever prepared me. It was something unique which no words could describe. Just at that moment, a person whose name I do not recall brought me a message from him that said, "Sri Ramakrishna is calling you." I went. Perhaps 7 years elapsed between Girish's first meeting with Ramakrishna and this incident, unlike only days which elapsed between the death of Golap's mother and her visit to Dakshineswar. In one of several magnet analogies in Vedanta, there's a description of the things of the world as an ordinary magnet and God as a huge one. Regardless of how close a needle is to the ordinary magnet, eventually the attraction of the huge one will win out and draw the needle to it. Eventually, we must all come to God. Perhaps Girish's needle was covered by more dirt and dross, but certainly his sorrows had been as deep as Golap's, but the time had to be right for both the teacher and the teaching. By the time of his fourth meeting with Ramakrishna, Girish was being inexorably drawn by the huge magnet. Girish followed Ramakrishna to Balaram's house. Quote, I asked him, what is a guru? He answered, do you know what the guru is? He is like a matchmaker. A matchmaker arranges for the union of the bride with the bridegroom. Likewise, a guru prepares for the meeting of the individual soul with his beloved, the divine spirit. Actually, he did not use the word matchmaker, but a slang expression more forceful. Then he said, you need not worry. Your guru has already been chosen. My heart was filled with unspeakable joy, for it seemed as though my search for a guru had ended. For did not Sri Ramakrishna say that my guru had already been chosen? Looking back at my former objections to a guru, I understood the pride and vanity which had lain behind my rationalizations. I had thought, after all, the guru is a man. The disciple is also a man. Why should one man stand before another with folded palms and follow him like a slave? But time after time, in the presence of Ramakrishna, my pride crumbled into dust. Meeting me at the theater, it had been he who first saluted me. How could my pride remain in the presence of such a humble man? The memory of his humility created an indelible impression on my mind. A few days after my visit with Balaram's, I was sitting in the dressing room of the theater when a devotee came to me in a hurry and said with some concern, Sri Ramakrishna is here in his carriage. I replied, very well, take him to the box and offer him a seat. But the devotee answered, won't you come to greet him personally and take him there yourself? With some annoyance, I said, does he need me? Can't he get there by himself? Nevertheless, I went. I found him alighting from the carriage. Seeing his serene and radiant face, my stony heart melted. I rebuked myself in shame, and that shame still haunts my memory. To think that I had refused to greet this sweet and gentle soul. Then I conducted him upstairs. There I saluted him, touching his feet. Even now, I do not understand the reason, but at that moment, a radical change came over me, and I was a different man. I offered him a rose, which he accepted, but he returned it again, saying, only a god or a dandy is entitled to flowers. What shall I do with it? There was a special room on the second floor of the Star Theater, which was intended for the visitors of the dress circle to sit in during the concert. So Ramakrishna came there, and a good number of devotees joined him. He started conversing with me. He spoke of several things while I listened longingly. I felt a spiritual current passing, as it were, through my body, from foot to head and head to foot. All of a sudden, Ramakrishna lost outer consciousness and went into ecstasy. And in that mood, he started talking with a young devotee. Many years earlier, I had heard some slandering remarks about him made by a very wicked man. Suddenly, I remembered those words, and at that moment, Sri Ramakrishna's ecstasy broke and his mood changed. Pointing towards me, he said, there is some crookedness in your heart. I thought, yes, indeed, plenty of it, of various kinds. But I was at a loss to understand which kind he was particularly referring to. I asked, how shall I get rid of it? Ramakrishna replied, have faith. This fifth visit was an important turning point in Girish's life. We can see how contrite he was at not initially going to meet Ramakrishna, a foreshadowing of the exceptional reverence Girish developed for the Master. He began to feel that Ramakrishna was like family, whose love and concern for Girish were unconditional, regardless of his many shortcomings. And the transformation Girish felt occurred when he saluted Ramakrishna and touched his feet. Once again, the Master's touch had a profound internal effect. Notice Girish's language following this touch, where he listened longingly to the Master's words. From a proud and haughty skeptic, Girish was on his way to becoming a great and humble devotee. Girish's bad habits continued, but they began to transform in unusual ways. Again, in Girish's words, quote, "One night, in a happy and drunken mood, I was visiting a house of prostitution with two of my friends, but suddenly I felt an urge to visit Sri Ramakrishna. My friends and I hired a carriage and drove out to Dakshineshwar. It was late at night, and everyone was asleep. The three of us entered Ramakrishna's room, tipsy and reeling. Sri Ramakrishna grasped both my hands and began to sing and dance in ecstasy. The thought flashed through my mind, here is a man whose love embraces all, even a wicked man like me, whose own family would condemn me in this state. Surely this holy man, respected by the righteous, is also the savior of the fallen." After these meetings with Ramakrishna, I began to wonder, who is this man who speaks to me with such intimacy and makes me feel that he is my very own? No longer do I fear my own sins, for I feel sure he would not condemn me. Though he seems to know me through and through, a confession might do me good. I must take shelter at his feet, for he alone can bring me peace. End quote. So here are Girish and his friends, happily inebriated, going straight from prostitutes to Ramakrishna, who grabs Girish's hands and begins to dance ecstatically. He keeps the party going, but he transforms it into his own party, where the dancing is inspired by God and not by Bacchus. This says volumes about Ramakrishna and his manner of teaching. First, this is prime evidence of the charge made against Ramakrishna at the time that he did not show sufficient moral abhorrence towards prostitutes and drunkards. As we know, the theater of the time was not considered an appropriate environment for women of good character, so the roles of women in plays were either taken by men dressed as women or by prostitutes or courtesans. Three of Girish's star actresses, Tara, Binodini, and Tinkari, came from this background and were themselves transformed by the influence of Girish and Ramakrishna. And none of this bothered Ramakrishna in the least. Like all great souls, Ramakrishna was an equal opportunity teacher who accepted the virtuous and the sinner alike. As the bumper sticker says, God bless the world, no exceptions. You only had to want to hear what he had to say. Second, Ramakrishna placed little emphasis on the bad habits themselves. We know that he railed against the emphasis on sin in the Brahma Samaj in the Bible. This conversation between Girish and Ramakrishna occurred at the Star Theater. Girish, please bless me, sir. Master, have faith in the Divine Mother and you will attain everything. Girish, but I am a sinner. Master, the wretch who constantly harps on sin becomes a sinner. Girish, sir, the ground where I used to sit, would become unholy. Master, how can you say that? Suppose a light is brought in a room that has been dark 1,000 years. Does it illumine the room little by little, or all in a flash? Girish, then you have blessed me. Master, if you sincerely believe it, what more shall I say? I eat and drink and chant the name of God. Notice how Ramakrishna downplays his ability to do anything for anyone, saying only that he eats, drinks, and chants the name of God. There's no question that in conventional religious terms, Girish was a sinner and engaged in nearly all of the common ones short of murder. He made no attempt to hide any of this and said, I've drunk so much wine in my life that if the wine bottles were placed one upon another, they would stand as high as Mount Everest. He had also used opium for 15 years, and we know he visited brothels. But none of this bothered Ramakrishna in the least. Ram Datta wrote in his biography of Ramakrishna, Once a devotee asked the master to tell Girish to give up drinking. The master replied, "Why do you have such a headache over him? He who is his guide will decide whether he should give up drinking or not. Moreover, he is a heroic devotee. Drinking will not do him any harm." Although we typically ignored it, at times Ramakrishna even seemed to support Girish's drinking. Swami Adbhutananda recalled, "Once Girish Babu came to Dakshineswar quite drunk. The master told me, 'Go and see if he left anything in the carriage. If you find something, bring it here.' I did as I was told and found a bottle of wine and a glass. I brought both to the master. When the devotees saw the wine bottle, they began to laugh, but the master said to me, 'Keep the bottle for him. He will want it for a final drink.'" Just see how liberal the master was toward his devotees. Ramakrishna knew those who came to him inside and out. He knew that Girish was as obstinate a person as could be, and it was pointless to tell him to do something because he would do the opposite. He also knew that in its time, the drinking would fall away by itself. Swamiji quoted the master as saying, "Why should you give up anything? It will give you up." Gradually, Girish did give up drinking and did not drink at all the last 20 years of his life. When someone asked him, "The master did not ask you to stop drinking. Why don't you drink?" Girish said, "Well, his permission has turned into prohibition in my case. Whenever a sinful thought arises, I see the master appear in my mind." Ramakrishna's method was to emphasize only love of God, knowing that love of lesser things would gradually be edged out. Third, Ramakrishna knew how to dance with drunks, which in fact he did on other occasions, even stopping his carriage on the street to dance with complete strangers who were drunk. Christopher Isherwood observed in a talk on Girish, quote, "What Ramakrishna profoundly understood was that all of our so-called vices are in fact frustrated attempts to find the truth or to find peace or to find release from something. Of course, nowadays we are much more sophisticated about things like this, and people do understand this to a greater extent. But you see, that was why Ramakrishna, looking at a drunkard dancing, could think, 'Why, that's the same as ecstasy, only he's going about it in the wrong way.' The drive behind it, the desire, is for a state of joy and the eternal. And therefore, Ramakrishna felt a tremendous kinship with people who were in this condition." End quote. Not only did he feel a kinship and share in their drunken dancing, Ramakrishna demonstrated how to get the same joy of love of God instead of love of liquor. Girish once told Ramakrishna that everything about you is illegal, meaning that he broke all the laws of Orthodox religion. So for Girish, Ramakrishna was a perfect teacher who could wholeheartedly redirect drunkenness toward God. Ramakrishna's method was to re-reference everything he touched in God's direction, including Girish. Girish Ghosh was one of the greatest playwrights and poets of Bengal and is considered the father of the Bengali theater. He is also considered one of Ramakrishna's greatest devotees. After Ramakrishna's death, Girish's losses continued, including 2 daughters, his second wife, and a young son. Only one son and a daughter survived. But his surrender to Ramakrishna was complete. When Gopal Ghosh, who later became Swami Advaitananda, had provided Ramakrishna with 12 pieces of ochre cloth and 12 rosaries, 11 were given to young disciples and the last reserved for Girish. For in spite of the life he'd lived, his faith and renunciation were second to none. As Girish himself said, "Look at me. I am Ramakrishna's miracle." 2 lives devastated by losses, 2 lives transformed by Ramakrishna's touch. He touched Golap Ma, Girish touched him. The result was similar. Whether you touch a bare electric wire or it touches you, either way you get a shock. If you accept that Ramakrishna was God himself, then it isn't too surprising that he could transform lives in the way he did. He had both the compassion and the ability to raise Golap Ma and Girish from the depths of their sorrow, making it indeed blessed sorrow. Ramakrishna enabled them to be who he knew they could be. Where does that leave us, though, who don't have the great blessing of the presence of an incarnation and the touch of grace from him? I would hope that it leaves us inspired. Inspired that transformation is possible for anyone. Inspired that God's help is always available if we sincerely ask. And inspired that wherever we are in life, we can always change for the better and for good. I've had the great good fortune of knowing many earnest devotees in my years in Vedanta. I can verify that many of them, and I really should say many of us, because I think I can count myself in that group, have been personally transformed through years of devotion and spiritual practices. A few have been dramatic, from lives of rebellion and apparent lack of purpose to lives of admirable character, humility, and wholehearted devotion. Most have made steady progress in their spiritual lives by holding fast to Ramakrishna and Holy Mother and staying the course. So this transformation is available to all of us simply through the grace of God and our own self-effort. We must be patient, though, and not expect instant or even rapid transformation. A medieval mystic said, "He who is in a hurry delays the things of God." Even with Ramakrishna's help, Girish's transformation took years. There's no question God will help us if we ask sincerely, but we must come with humble, patient hearts and let it happen in God's time, not ours. In the interest of applying what we've heard in the lives of Golap Ma and Girish toward our own transformations, let's review some of the lessons we can learn from them. When you are at your wit's end, ask God for help. Cry for God instead. God alone is real. Be touchable. If you're sad, eat. If you want to learn, listen. Have faith. Let bad habits give you up. Things only happen at the right time. And finally, a little joyful dancing is good for the soul. Golap Ma and Girish Ghosh were very different personalities with similar stories of transformation through bad times. Golap Ma was an organized, disciplined person who loved order and cleanliness. Girish was an inspired bohemian who rarely ate or slept at the same time from one day to the next. Yet both were drawn to Ramakrishna through intense grief and despair. Golap Ma in a matter of days, Girish over a period of years. Both suffered tremendous personal losses. Golap Ma lost her husband and both children. Girish lost 2 wives and 4 children. Both found in Ramakrishna's touch and teaching the love and inspiration which transformed their lives into shining examples for all of us. Golap Ma of devotion, purity, and attachment. Girish of extraordinary faith and renunciation. May we all be inspired by these transformations of Golap Ma and Girish. May we all know that bad times are occasions good learners would not miss. And may we all realize that God's help with our own transformation is always available if we just ask. That is my prayer for all of us today. Oh. May we follow thy path, O Lord, with unwavering faith and one-pointed devotion. Give us such spiritual insight that we may realize our union with thy divine being, and may this so strengthen us that in the dark hours we may still remain grateful for your unfailing blessing. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.